More British casualties in Afghanistan as London seems to send contradictory signals regarding its mission in this war-torn country. Just what's the actual cost of the UK military presence in Afghanistan and what future for its troops there? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Abdul Hamid. It's almost a decade since British troops got involved in Afghanistan. Initially, the goals, as stated by then Prime Minister Tony Blair, were to eradicate the so-called terror networks and topple the Taliban regime. But that has proved not to be easy, and London is now sending mixed signals. The Chief of the General Staff, Sir David Richards, says the mission in Afghanistan could last for as long as 30 to 40 years. A statement that seems in tune with the Defence Secretary, Liam Fox, who recently said that British troops will be among the last to depart from Afghanistan. But as Nadeem Baba reports, the British Prime Minister has a different opinion.
A familiar sound for people in Wootton Bassett. Here, the bodies of 7 British servicemen killed last week in Afghanistan are driven through the small town. They've come from a nearby airbase where so-called repatriation flights arrive almost every week, a painful time for every set of relatives. This has almost become a common sight in the skies above southwest England. A military aircraft carrying the coffins of British soldiers killed in Afghanistan and serving to the British public as a reminder of the human cost of the conflict. This former soldier is 83 years old, and he says as long as he's healthy, he'll be coming to pay his respects.
They gave their life, and I think it's the only reason I should come and support them.
But with the British death toll in Afghanistan now well over 300 and the fighting intensifying in Helmand province, public support for the war itself has plummeted.
As casualty numbers amongst British troops have risen and risen over the years, we've also seen support for the war collapse. In our most recent Comrades poll, we found that 3/4 of the British public don't just believe that the war in Afghanistan is something the British Army should come out of, but it's also a war that's unwinnable. I think as far as British public opinion is concerned, it's time to leave Afghanistan.
Britain's new coalition government has argued that being in Afghanistan is still crucial in preventing terrorism being exported from the region. It's a point the Prime Minister made as he met President Hamid Karzai in Kabul.
For me, the issue of Afghanistan is the most important foreign policy issue, the most important national security issue for my country, and it is that national security approach that I want to stress here today.
Aware of public opinion, David Cameron has made clear he hopes British troops can be pulled out by 2015, but with the caveat that Afghan forces must be in a position to stabilise the country. The Afghan conflict has now cost the UK around $16 billion. Another summer of heavy fighting inevitably means more sad occasions here in Wootton Bassett and more debate over Britain's involvement. Nadeem Baba for Inside Story.
Well, joining me to discuss the topic, in London, Richard Kemp, former commander of British forces in Afghanistan. In Westminster, Dan Plesh, director of the Centre for International Studies and Diplomacy at the School of Oriental and African Studies. And in Kabul, Haroon Mir, director of the Centre for Research and Policy Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Dan Plesh, let me start with you. Why are we getting such mixed signals from the leadership in the UK?
I think that there are deep divisions within the government about how to handle this issue. From David Cameron, one gets on the one hand this great overstatement that Afghanistan is the greatest issue in world politics for Britain, notwithstanding the economic crisis, global warming, and many other issues. And on the other hand, basically wanting to send a signal to the voters that the UK will be out by the time the voters go to the polls again. In contrast, you have the Defence Secretary and the Ministry of Defence realising the difficulty, if not the impossibility of the problem, seeing that this is something that they think that the UK should be in more or less for the indefinite future. But if I may say, there is a huge problem in British politics, in our democracy, in that no political party, none of the main political parties, represents the overwhelming view of the British public, which is that the UK should not be there. And regardless of whether you agree with the public or not, it is undermining of democracy that none of the main parties reflects such overwhelming view amongst the public.
Well, Richard Kemp, with 100 foreign soldiers dead in June alone, don't we get the idea that actually the Taliban at the moment have the upper hand?
Could I take up one, before I answer that, could I take up a point that Dan made just now, which is that the political parties' views are undermining democracy? That's not the case. The political parties are not here to reflect public opinion. They're here to lead public opinion. And I think the reason why British public opinion is so opposed as it is to the war in Afghanistan is because they don't understand it. And the reason for that is because the government, the previous government, did not explain clearly and make it absolutely plain what the reason is that we're there and what the penalties would be if we left. In terms of who is winning and losing, I agree with you. I think we are not winning against the Taliban at present. I don't think we're losing. I think we're just about containing them, preventing them from expanding their presence, in some cases removing the threat of the Taliban from some areas of Afghanistan. But we are fighting very much what is a holding action at present. And that's why President Obama and other NATO leaders decided to deploy extra forces into Afghanistan to try and hit back it with a bit more clout militarily against the Taliban, while at the same time building up the Afghan National Security Forces in order that they can, in due course, take over responsibility for the counterinsurgency campaign against a further written down Taliban. Now, none of that is easy, and I'm not pretending it is easy, but I think that's the objective, and we need to hold our nerve despite the casualties we're facing. The British government does need to make it clear to the people why we're there and what the consequences would be of not being there.
Well, Harun Mir, despite these surge troops pouring into the country, the Taliban are able to carry out quite spectacular attacks, especially since the beginning of their summer offensive. Now, what is the perception among ordinary Afghans? Who is winning this battle?
Clearly, after the speech of President Obama when he was in Kabul, and he said specifically that the U.S. intention and the military surge is to break the Taliban's momentum. But unfortunately, we are in July, and Taliban still have an upper hand. And in Afghanistan and for Afghans, I think we already talk about a military defeat of NATO and American forces in Afghanistan against the Taliban, because not only the American forces have not been able to stabilize Morja, which is a small town in a district, and now the military operation in Kandahar is also postponed because there was no preparation. And in the meantime, Taliban have been able to open new fronts in other provinces in northern part of the country, which were relatively peaceful even 6 months ago. I think for many Afghans, Taliban are winning, and it's clear, and we could not explain it other ways.
And Dan Plesh, do you think that the war is so unpopular in the UK because there is a perception that 9 years after the Taliban are there, they're very strong, or just because the UK feels that there's many problems at home and that the politicians should be concentrating on the problems at home?
I think people understand that it's an unwinnable conflict. They know that the British have fought and lost there throughout the last century or two. And I think also there is an awareness that the terrorism threat is actually generated by foreign military operations in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And underlying this, there is, of course, the problem that we see very little in our media and television about the Afghans, military and otherwise, killed by NATO action. Quite rightly, we commemorate our own British war dead, but we need to have a broader, objective public discussion in this time, and not this rather sort of 19th century sole focus on our own sacrifice, which is fine, but it doesn't actually provide the public with a proper picture.
But Richard Kemp, you were in Afghanistan a few years ago. Do you know what went wrong? What brought the situation to what it is today?
Well, I can make a stab at it. I mean, I wholeheartedly support what Dan says there. I think he's absolutely right that the British public is not getting a full picture. They're just hearing about the casualties coming home. They don't understand the progress that's being made against the Taliban, even though I agree with what's been said on this programme about the fact we are not at present winning it. But I think what happened was that back in 2003, when we invaded Iraq, the eye went very much off the ball in Afghanistan. I think the Afghan government at that stage was potentially online to be a success, and it was left to its own devices to a large extent by the international community, and we've seen what happened to that in terms of corruption and failing to command the respect or support of the majority of the Afghan people. And in military terms, the military campaign was neglected, the security was neglected, the training of the Afghan National Security Force was neglected, while the emphasis was on Iraq. So that, I think, was where things went wrong. And then, back in 2005, 2006, it became quickly clear that things needed to be addressed. And then, additional effort was put in, but it's not been enough. The effort has not been enough. I disagree that this is an unwinnable campaign, an unwinnable war. I also disagree that we, the British, have been defeated consistently in Afghanistan before. I think we have won certainly 2 out of our 3 Afghan wars in the past, possibly even all 3. It depends how you interpret it. Well, I think the hallmark has been that we've been engaged in military action there, and then we have left quite rapidly after that. And I think that is the key. The Afghan people don't want us there for a moment longer than we need to be there, but they don't want the Taliban there either. And I think it's important that that we show continued commitment, and commitment not just in words, but also commitment in military power and political resources and persuasion and economic development. We show our commitment to winning this campaign. I think by doing that, potentially we can win it. If we don't do that, if we don't put huge effort in and huge resources in that are needed, then it will not be winnable.
But Harun Mir, you were just pointing out earlier that what happens is, you were giving an example actually of the Marja operation. Lots of British with American and Afghan troops went in there, but the results were not there. The Taliban are still there. Probably during the day they're farmers, and in the evening they're Taliban, aren't they?
Yes, indeed. And I think, according to General McChrystal's counterinsurgency, I think the military operation was only one aspect of it. And there was need for Afghan government to take responsibility and to provide governance and also services to the Afghan people. But unfortunately, the Afghan government is unable, because the Afghan government is still struggling with the corruption inside at very high as well as low level. On the other hand, I think the Afghan security forces are not yet ready to take responsibility from NATO when it comes to providing security. And I think NATO soldiers are not prepared to provide security, and they are not law enforcement forces. And another important aspect, in my opinion, which was totally ignored during the past 6 months, and we were hoping that there would be heavy pressure on Pakistan to go after Taliban leadership, because Pakistanis until now, they have not been strong when it comes to Afghan Taliban. They have certainly launched a number of military offensive against Pakistani Taliban, but the Afghan Taliban leadership are still at large. They are enjoying safe havens in Pakistan, and as long as the leadership is intact and they receive financial and military support, we could not win the insurgency. By killing Taliban soldiers, we will never end this insurgency, because Taliban could recruit more and more Taliban within madrasas in Pakistan, as well as within the disenfranchised young Afghans who have no other option than to work with the Taliban, because at least they could provide them 3 times free meal.
Well, Richard Kemp, there is a perception in Afghanistan that when the British were alone in the Helmand province, they were not willing to go that extra mile, or they didn't even have the equipment really to fight that extra mile. And that's one of the reasons that things went so wrong.
I think that's an entirely fair point, and the problem became too big for the British, and the British weren't prepared. The British government was not prepared to put the effort in. Arguably did not have enough resources to put the effort in, but I agree with that. Now the Americans have arrived, and the Americans have put very significant resources into Helmand, which I would certainly hope and expect will turn the situation around there. I also agree completely that the key to undermining this insurgency in Afghanistan is Pakistan. The Pakistan government, according to some people, and I think probably rightly, supports the Taliban, the Afghan Taliban. It's not just that they're not attacking them, they're also, to a large extent, supporting the Afghan Taliban. And that needs to be stopped. Now, it's easier said than done, but I think if the Pakistani government did not support the Afghan Taliban, then they would not have anything like the capability to have. So much more emphasis needs to be put into that area, as well as attacking the Taliban wherever they raise their heads in Afghanistan, and trying to split off those elements of the Taliban that are open to persuasion. And of course, the hardcore won't be, and that's been made clear time and again by the leadership. But there are elements of the Taliban who are fighting NATO and fighting the Afghan government forces for different reasons, and some of those could be persuaded to give up that fight or even come onto the other side.
And Dan Plesh, at the moment there are some people in London who actually favor negotiating with the Taliban, maybe somehow admitting that a military solution is not possible.
Well, it takes two to tango, and I think many on the Taliban side feel, and we had this reported recently, that they're winning and they don't need to negotiate. But there is another dimension here. There is a very serious question, which I don't think is debated nearly enough, which is whether part of the motivation for the 9/11 attacks was to draw the Americans into an unwinnable, endless guerrilla war, such as damaged the Soviet Union. And once you start thinking as to whether the West is in Afghanistan because it was lured into a trap, then the whole situation, I think, looks rather different. And whether or not that is the case, what I find disturbing is that very obvious question is so difficult to have debated at all.
Well, Harun Mir, I just wanted to know, do Afghans look at the British soldiers differently than do the American soldiers? Do they make any distinction there, or is just the whole, they look at it as a whole as NATO forces in the country?
Well, Afghans are not in direct contact with the military. Most of the time, the military are either in their barracks or are in the villages where there is a conflict. And I think we don't make a distinction between the American and British forces in terms of the military, but there are some worries about the politics. We all know that there is disagreement or difference of opinion between the British and the US government, because Britain has other worries in Afghanistan, and I think one of the priority for Britain is the stability in Pakistan, and it's more important than stability in Afghanistan. And so I think we hear a lot of favorable voice in the UK when it comes to negotiation with the Taliban. But for Americans, it would be very difficult to accept the Haqqani network to come and negotiate in Kabul, because this is an integral part of Al-Qaeda, and it will be very difficult for Americans to sell it to their public opinion, because the war was started in Afghanistan in order to defeat and eliminate Al-Qaeda. And these difficulties are certainly impacting the whole strategy in Afghanistan, and we are hopeful that we will have a unified voice from all NATO countries, and most importantly from Britain and the United States.
Well, actually, General Petraeus, in his first public appearance at NATO headquarters in Brussels, Richard Kemp, was calling for this united front. So this divergence of, let's say, command centers among the different countries, how much has that harmed the mission?
It has harmed the mission in the past, but I think we've now overcome most of the difficulties, and the different NATO headquarters, particularly the British and the American headquarters, do work very, very closely together and with good cooperation. I don't recognise a real divergence of strategy between the US and the UK, as we've just heard. I don't recognise that at all. I think maybe the Americans are more reluctant to accept negotiation, but I think we should be reluctant to accept negotiation unless it is very heavily on our terms, because we can't, what's the point in negotiating with a group who are only prepared to come back and re-establish the same kind of regime in Afghanistan as they had before? We shouldn't negotiate with them on those terms. And the only time we can negotiate with them on favourable terms to us is when we have the upper hand, which we don't have at present. So there's not much point in proper negotiation with the hardcore elements. As I say, some of them can be split across. In terms of Pakistani stability, it is of course extremely important to us, and we should not differentiate, in my view, much between Pakistan and Afghanistan as operational theatres. The two are interdependent and interlocked. And the Pakistani government has a massive insurgency on its own hands. And one of the big penalties of us withdrawing from Afghanistan, as some people are suggesting we should, would be that would leave a vacuum a security vacuum in that country from which insurgents could strengthen and support the insurgency in Pakistan, making that situation more unstable and more dangerous, and leading potentially to not just the implications that would follow for our own significant Pakistani community over here, but also the risk of a nuclear-armed state falling into the hands of extremists.
Well, Dan Plesh, you seem to disagree there.
The solution and the dynamics are extremely serious and need to be pursued with the Pakistan government directly. But I don't think it's necessarily the case that the people living in southern Afghanistan, the Pashtun people, have any particular desire in the majority to take the war into Pakistan. Their general feeling is they want foreign invaders out of their country. But I do think it's very important to resolve the command and control issues that still bedevil the West, and I think make many people on the outside, it makes them people feel very reluctant to take the Western operation seriously when these sort of fundamental bureaucratic problems aren't solved. And perhaps Richard can help. But as last time I looked, and this may have changed recently, that even on the American side, part of the American forces reported through a chain of command to Brussels and Belgium, and part reported back through to CENTCOM in Florida. Is that still the case?
Richard Kemp, if you'd like to reply to that.
No, I agree with what you say, and that caused, I think, significant problems. At the time I was there, there was many different chains of command, but that now has been resolved, and there's now a single unified command under General Petraeus, which exercises authority across all NATO forces, including US forces in Afghanistan. In some cases, I think there are elements that have, sort of separate strategic roles that answer back to national capitals, and that will always be the case with military forces. But I don't think, as far as I'm aware at present, and talking to the commanders I talk to, I don't think that any longer poses the same threat to the cohesion of the missions it once did.
And Harun Mir, the last word for you. Now, it seems to me that the Afghan people, many of them at least, do favor negotiating with the Taliban, saying that the Taliban are Afghan people at the end of the day. Do you think that the British could have a bigger role in the sense that many people in London think like that, and also they have more extensive knowledge of the Afghan people?
Indeed, everybody in Afghanistan is in favor of peace and stability because we are tied with conflict. It has been 3 decades that we are in this situation. But the problem is that we could not negotiate with a very weak government in Kabul. President Karzai's coalition is very fragile. It could unravel at any time. And this is the difficulty, that when we start negotiating from a position of weakness, and as it's happening right now, I think President Karzai is surrendering himself to the Taliban via Taliban to the Pakistanis, because he has been giving all advantages that Taliban and Pakistanis was asking from President Karzai. For example, the peace jirga gave all kind of favor to the Taliban. For example, release of Taliban prisoners, and most importantly, the resignation of 2 senior government officials who were competent in the Afghan government, the Minister of Interior and the Chief of Afghan National Directorate of Security. And we see it in a way that it is important to negotiate, but we have to negotiate in order to safeguard what we have achieved in the last 8 years. For example, our constitution is very important to us. For example, women's rights, human rights, free speech, freedom of press in Afghanistan. And there are risks that we might
sorry to
lose
interrupt,
everything.
but we did reach the end of the program. I mean, opinions will be changing many more times, and I think we will all be sitting together talking about this again. So Dan Plesh, Richard Kemp, and Harun Mir, thank you so much for your interesting thoughts, and thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Goodbye for now.